snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
Hello, everyone, and welcome in to another episode here of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com, joined by Ben McKee, our staff writer at RTI. He's also the co-host and producer of the Swain Event morning radio show. It goes on every morning from 7 till 10 a.m. You can listen to it on the Swain Event app or on YouTube, or Periscope, and Facebook Live. They have the Swain Event TV as well. Well, we appreciate all of you tuning in. If this is your first time, thank you so much for listening to the RTI Podcast. If you want more episodes of the show, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts. If you have an Android phone, you can listen to us on whatever podcaster app you use on your Android phone. You can also subscribe to the podcast, or usually subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is the way a lot of you listen and interact with the podcast, both this one and the RTI and VR2 recruiting podcast, which we did 2 of those last week. So check it out if you hadn't had a chance to check those out either. RockyTopInsider.com is a website, and you can click on the podcast tab there as well and listen to it straight from the webpage, listen to / watch the YouTube video from there, or download the podcast from the webpage as well. Well, Ben, we got a lot going on. I know we only did one actual RTI podcast last week, but it was a bye week. I figured we both could maybe use a break from doing a little bit of, we didn't go full board everything we always do, but we had plenty of stuff to cover last week anyway, with it being a bye week, because it is basketball season as well. And that's actually where I want to start this episode of the podcast. So if you want some football content, fast forward a little bit to the end, but I imagine a lot of you are big basketball fans as well. And Ben, we have a lot to talk about with the basketball team. We haven't had a chance to really sit here and talk about the basketball team, either the men's or Lady Vols, on the podcast, really. Both teams on Monday found out they are ranked for the first time this season. For Lady Vols, first time since about mid-year last year. For Tennessee, first time since, the final AP poll of last season. They obviously spent last year as a wire-to-wire top 10 team. This year started just outside the top 25 at around number 28 or so, if you look at how receiving votes and things like that. But both the men's team and Lady Vols got impressive victories over last week. The men's team goes up to Canada on a neutral site and defeats number 20 Washington. And Ben, not just defeat them, but that game was never really in question. Tennessee pretty much had the upper hand, not from the opening tip, because it was, I guess, a little back and forth in the first couple minutes of the game. But once Tennessee got a 5-6 point lead, they never looked back. The closest Washington could cut it back down to the second half was 7 points, and that was with Tennessee going on a cold spell on offense. And even then, Washington's offense couldn't get a whole lot going. You had Isaiah Stewart, who was having his way early on in the game against John Fulkerson, but then once Fulke and then Olivier Campbell both kind of settled in and adjusted, he ended up finishing the second half with, I think, only like 3 or 4 points. He had, I think, 10, 12 points in the first half and only missed one shot. I think it was 10 points on 5 of 6 shooting. And he finished the game with about 14, 16 points, is because they shut him down in the second half for the most part. That win was very impressive. I think with Washington, they're a little bit younger of a team. They'll kind of figure things out as the season goes on. I think they'll be more dangerous in February and March than they are right now, with the two 5-star freshmen, Quade Green, who's a Kentucky transfer, who's a former 5-star as well. But that's still, that's a really good win, a 13-point win on a neutral site. Lady Vols go and grab a double-digit victory over they were number 15 Notre Dame. They knocked them out of the polls after that loss. The Lady Vols. Lady Vols come at number 23 in the poll. Men come at number 20. Ben, how surprising has, for both seasons, we can kind of talk a little bit more about the men's team if you want to, but it doesn't matter to me, but how surprising have both seasons been to you? Because I don't know that. I think the Lady Vols has maybe been a little more surprising, because I haven't, with as kind of bad as the season ended with them last year, people weren't expecting them to do a whole lot this year. They were expecting, Kelly Harper to maybe get more out of the team than what Holly Warlick did. But I don't think, you and me both, neither one were expecting the Lady Vols to go up to Notre Dame and get that win. They didn't just get a win. Kind of look at the Washington game with the men's team. They controlled that game for a lot of it. There was, Notre Dame made a run, got it a little bit closer, but for the most part, Lady Vols had that game on lock for a lot of the game. It was a lot to do with the defense Lady Vols played. I've been thoroughly impressed with both these starts. We'll see once they get into both teams get into SEC play. The SEC is going to be tough for both the men's and women's side this year, for both schools, both teams, both programs. I've been very pleasantly surprised by what both the men's and women's basketball teams have done for Tennessee to start this season.
No, for sure. How can you not be impressed with what both teams have done? If we want to kind of look at the games that you referenced, the Washington game and the Notre Dame game, that's why I am surprised by Tennessee's start, and for two different reasons. When you kind of look at each team, with the men's team, I did not expect them to beat Washington. That's really been the only surprising part about this season to me, is that they were able to beat Washington, and it's just because Washington has so much talent on its team right now. I know it doesn't necessarily look like it by the way that they play, but they simply just have not figured out the puzzle pieces yet. And once they figure out how to play with those two five-star freshmen, Jay-Z's nephew and Quade Green, that is going to be a very good basketball team that could make an Elite Eight type run come March. So just because of what all Tennessee lost and how much production they are having to replace, yes, they have Lamonte Turner, yes, they have Jordan Bowden, but the development of Yves Pons and John Fulkerson not necessarily filling up the stat sheet, but being so effective on both ends. When you put up that foursome against Washington's foursome, top four players, Tennessee's really not supposed to compete on paper. So for Tennessee to go out and dominate Washington the way that they did from start to finish, that was surprising to me. That's really been the only surprising. Them winning that game, and then where Yves Pons currently is, has been the two biggest surprises to me this season. So I'm definitely surprised by Tennessee's start to the season. Nothing against Tennessee and Rick Barnes, but I did expect them to be 2-1 simply because kind of like how Washington is trying to figure out how to put all the puzzle pieces together. I thought Tennessee would take 5-7 games, not necessarily of them losing, but of them maybe having some challenging games the first stretch of the season as they figure out life without Admiral and Grant and those guys. So I'm surprised by Yves Pons. I'm surprised by them being 3-0 and ranked this early. Again, not because I didn't think that they had the potential to be a good team. It's just I thought that it was going to take them some time to really figure things out. And I guess another aspect I'm surprised by is Josiah Jordan James. I don't think he's necessarily playing bad basketball, but he's not producing at the level that we anticipated because he had that 5-star billing next to his name. I'm truly simply chalking it up to the fact that he missed all of October with an injury, and hip injury that was bothering him. He did not get to practice with Lamonte Turner, Jordan Bowden until the exhibition game, and Rick Barnes said this after the exhibition game against Eastern New Mexico. That was the first time, including practice, that Josiah Jordan James and Lamonte Turner and Jordan Bowden got to play together for an entire practice, or in this case, an entire game. They had a private scrimmage against Davidson, and they weren't able to do that. So Josiah is knocking off rust while also trying to settle in, and he is pressing a little bit, but those would be the three surprising things to me. And then you kind of look at the Lady Vols, and it's kind of rooted in the same thought process as to why it's surprising, just because, Kelly Harper is a new coach at Tennessee for a reason. That's because Holly Warlick was not able to get the job done. That's because the culture under Holly Warlick was not acceptable. And so for them to go out and beat number 15 Notre Dame on the road is so impressive. And, honestly, of the two wins that the basketball teams have had to this point, the men's team's win over Washington is more impressive than the Lady Vols win over Notre Dame. And not to take anything away from the Lady Vols game, and we're nitpicking at this point just for the sake of this conversation, but that Washington team, as I mentioned, had a ton of talent. Again, they are going to be a strong team come March once they put the puzzle pieces together, whereas Notre Dame, they're kind of in a similar situation, but they lost over 10,000 points worth of production to the WNBA or to graduation. That is just a ridiculous amount of production to lose from one season to the next. So I don't think that Notre Dame, and obviously the rankings signal this today because they're not in the rankings like you mentioned, Nathaniel, but that wasn't the 15th best team in the country. What was impressive about that win for the Lady Vols was that a young, inexperienced group of basketball players and coaches who haven't coached together, who haven't played together, who haven't worked together, when you look at the coaches and the players combined, they were able to go up to Notre Dame the day after they found out their second-best player, Zay Green, had torn her ACL and was out for the year. They were able to go up to South Bend in that atmosphere and pick up a win in which, like Tennessee's team dominated Washington, the Lady Vols dominated Notre Dame. So Notre Dame wasn't the 15th best team in the country. They were ranked the 15th best team in the country because of the brand name, because of who their head coach is, because of what they have done over the last couple of seasons. But they weren't the 15th most talented team in the country, where Washington is a top 15, top 20 team in terms of talent. So both wins are impressive and both are surprising. And although Notre Dame lost all of that production, I did not expect the Lady Vols to go up to South Bend and not only win but dominate the way that they did. Renee Davis was just tremendous. But again, I did not expect that just because simply Kelly Harper's trying to instill a culture. They still lack talent. They lack depth, and we haven't really seen it yet. But the lack of post presence that the Lady Vols have, that is going to catch up to them at some point. So there's a lot of things working against the Lady Vols, and for them to start off the season 4-0 with a dominating win over Notre Dame on the road, that is very surprising to me.
Yeah, like I said, both these teams have been very surprising to me. I think I'm more surprised with the Lady Vols than the men's team because at least the men's team, you lost a lot from last year, but you still had two really good guards. You brought in a 5-star with Josiah Jordan James, and you thought, this team, if they'd gotten Uroš Plagic eligible, you thought, hey, this team's got a chance to definitely not only make the tournament, but maybe make a little bit of noise in the tournament. But even without Uroš, like you mentioned, even without Josiah Jordan James making as big of a contribution as a scorer as as we kind of thought he might, this team's rolling right along. I mean, they obviously haven't. Washington was their first big test, but I think Murray State is a team that might be better than a lot of people or think they're going to be or expect them to be. And I think Murray State was a good test for this team. And that was a game where Tennessee was down at halftime by 9 points and ended up winning by 19. I mean, they came out and just flat out dominated in the second half of that game. But I think you touched on them earlier too, Ben. To me, the absolute biggest surprise of this basketball season, regardless of regardless of team, not just of a team, but it's just from an individual perspective and just overall the biggest surprise of this season. I don't know how you can't say that it's Yves Pons. Yves Pons went from scoring 2.2 points per game last season. In his first 59 games as a Vol, he totaled 94 points. He wasn't even averaging in his Tennessee career 2 points a game in his first two seasons. He's come out this season, he's averaging 16.3 points, 4.7 rebounds, and almost 3 blocks a game. And granted, this is just 3 games into the season. He had a pretty decent start to the season last year. No, not like this, obviously, but he had a pretty decent start to the year last year. He's at his previous career high of 10 points in Tennessee's one of the early games of the season. I think like within the first 6 games of the season, he was playing pretty well. So I'll be very interested to see if this can continue once Tennessee gets into the SEC play. But if this holds up, I don't expect Pons to keep averaging 16 points a game. But even if he averages, 12, 13 points a game the rest of the season, Ben, I think Yves Pons' turnaround from what we saw of him as a freshman and sophomore, I guess more last year, he didn't really play a ton as a freshman. But what we've seen of him in the first 2 years to what we see of him now, I think this might be Rick Barnes' best success story to date at Tennessee. I didn't obviously follow him as much at Texas. I don't want to speak to as much what he did at Texas. But I think it could be an even greater success story than what he did with guys like Admiral, like with Grant, with Kyle Alexander, and Jordan Bone. I think Pons, while he was rated a little bit higher on the recruiting services than all those guys were, Pons was a 4-star, but his was based largely on potential. He came into Tennessee with not the greatest basketball IQ. That's not his fault. He hasn't played basketball for a super long time before he got to Tennessee, and he was more known for his dunks, and his 4-star was more based on athleticism and potential. what we saw from him last year, Ben, aside from some stuff he did early on in the season, but for the vast majority of his sophomore year, Pons to me looked like a guy who was not comfortable on the floor. He looked like when he got the ball in his hand, he wanted to get rid of it and give it to someone else, unless he was, driving for a dunk. Or if he was open for three, he would sometimes not even take the open three and pass it. To me, he seemed like he had no confidence in his offensive game. And he was a pretty good defender. I mean, he's always been a good defender. But even that this season, he's taken to the next level. I just think, like I said, I don't expect him to continue this 16-point per game average for the rest of the season. But I really genuinely believe, and I wrote about it a little bit on Sunday night, so if y'all want to check out RocketHopInsider.com and look at the article that I did on it, I really truly believe that, like I said, as long as he doesn't have a gigantic drop-off for the rest of the season, he averages still 13, 12 points per season or per game this season, I do genuinely believe from what we saw of Yves Pons in his first 2 years to now, that would be the greatest success story. Because even Admiral Schofield, he didn't have this big of a jump from one season to the next. I mean, he had a coming out party from his sophomore year to his junior year, but it wasn't to the same degree. He was still a pretty decent contributor to Tennessee as a sophomore. They were still relying on him to play 20-ish minutes a game in his sophomore season. Grant Williams came in and he had a much better freshman year than a lot of people expected. Obviously, he had the SEC Player of the Year season as a sophomore. Kyle Alexander showed a lot of growth, but his was a lot more gradual. He didn't have I wouldn't say he necessarily had a breakout season. I don't think he ever really technically broke out. He just got better year after year while he's at Tennessee. Jordan Moten had a breakout season, obviously, as a junior, but even still, like, once again, he was a contributor, a consistent contributor as a freshman and especially as a sophomore, where he was running point for Tennessee and had a really good sophomore campaign as far as an assist to turnover ratio. Pons wasn't asked to do a whole lot. He was asked to be a good defender. He started some games for Tennessee because of his defense and because Bowden was thriving as that sixth man role. But the absolute just drastic shift in Pons' minutes and his production and everything this year based off last year, I mean, it came out of nowhere. We were talking about before the season, you and I were, a lot of media members, a lot of fans were, where's that third scoring option going to come from? Because Bowden and Turner were going to be relied on, most people thought, to be the top two scorers, and I think they obviously will this season. But I think a lot of people were circling, decide Jordan James to be that third option. Maybe if Jalen Johnson got all together because he has a good offensive game, maybe he could be that third option. I don't think a lot of people were expecting Yves Pons to be it, and if they were, I don't think they were expecting this kind of start to his season. So I think Yves Pons could very well be the greatest success story of the Rick Barnes era at Tennessee. That's not to discount obviously what he helped do, and he and Grant Williams himself helped do to help him become from a 3-star prospect to the 2-time SEC Player of the Year, an All-American, and will probably have his jersey retired. I don't think Yves Pons will become that, but to me, from what they were asking him to do and what he was doing and just how he was playing his first 2 years to what he's suddenly doing now, I mean, it's like there's two totally different players. It's like it's not even the same Yves Pons out there as we saw as a freshman and sophomore.
Yeah, I don't know which side I fall on with this argument. Yves Pons is definitely up near the top in terms of Rick Barnes taking somebody that he has signed and turning them into a very good basketball player. There's no doubt about it. Now, technically, this is a very small sample size. It's only 3 games. I do think that this carries out. I do think that this is an Yves Pons that we will get the rest of the season and his senior season next year. Maybe not 16 points per game, but definitely, 12 points per game, around that 5 rebound mark, 50% shooter from the field. I definitely think that we will get that. I'm just trying to decipher in my head, is it more impressive to take an athlete who is just ridiculous like Yves Pons is, somebody who can jump out of the gym, somebody who can block every shot, somebody who can get up there and rebound, somebody who's that's just strong and built as he is? Is it more impressive to take an Yves Pons type athlete and turn him into a basketball player, or is it more impressive to mold a solid basketball player like Grant Williams into a 2-time SEC Player of the Year? Like Admiral Schofield and Grant Williams had skill when those two arrived on campus. Their problem was they were out of shape and they just needed to develop at this level. So is that more important than or more impressive, I mean to say, is that more impressive than taking an Yves Pons who can do everything athletically that you want, but he just needs to become comfortable within the American basketball system rather than the European basketball system that he was playing in. So I don't really know which part of the aisle I fall on. I think I tend to agree with you because at least with Grant Williams and Admiral Schofield, it's a little bit easier to refine their skills rather than having to just kind of, with Pons, you just had to completely wipe out his jump shot and almost start over. So I do think that I tend to agree with you saying that this is Rick Barnes' most impressive project yet. But there's so many. I mean, you could say Lamonte Turner, you could say Jordan Bowden, you could say Kyle Alexander, you could say Grant Williams, Admiral Schofield, Yves Pons. There are just so many guys that you could say during Rick Barnes' time at Tennessee that, well, these guys just continued to improve and improve and improve. There really hasn't been a ton of guys that haven't improved under Rick Barnes. I guess the one that comes to mind is Jalen Johnson. It just seems like we've had the same Jalen Johnson since the moment he stepped foot on campus. And, I mean, he's had some swing and misses in recruiting like a Chris Darrington, like a Ray Kasango. But for the most part, Rick Barnes is almost batting 1,000 in terms of not only signing good basketball players, but then also developing them once they get here, taking them from intriguing prospects to really good college basketball players. But Yves Pons is just a testament to Rick Barnes and his coaching staff's ability to develop players, and that's why it's paying off for him so well on the recruiting trail right now.
Yeah, I think the only other person you mentioned that maybe guys who haven't developed or haven't improved under Barnes, the only other guy I would throw in there besides Jalen Johnson, because Johnson's at least, I think he's offensively improved, but defensively it just seems like for whatever reason he hasn't. I think the only other one you could throw in there, maybe it's not fair because maybe injuries have hampered him more than we know, but Zach Kent just has never done anything. I mean, he didn't play in Tennessee's game against Washington. Of course, Tennessee only played 7 guys against Washington. Tennessee only has 10 scholarship guys who are eligible this season, but he didn't play at all against Washington. He came in late in the other 2 games. I think he's only played 2 games this year. He's averaging 5 minutes per game. He's only scored a couple points on the year, 3 points, and that was on a field goal. Then he made a 3-pointer. That's his only basket of the season. He has 2 rebounds, 3 points, a turnover, and a foul in 10 minutes of play. So that's the other guy I would kind of throw in. Is that's going to happen though. You're not going to be able to swing and hit on everyone. You're not going to be able to hit doubles, triples, and home runs on every single person. Derek Walker's another kind of example. He showed some flashes, but never quite could put it all together at Tennessee with Rick Barnes. But I think in this case, the hits far outweigh the kind of the whiffs at this point for Rick Barnes, because you have the hits of all the 4 guys we just mentioned who are now into the NBA, or at least Bones playing in the G League. He got drafted. Alexander's playing in the G League as well, and obviously Grant and Admiral are playing in the NBA. Admiral's kind of going back and forth, but they're all consistently the professionals at this point. It looks like Turner and Bowden have been developed into potential professional players as well, whether it's the NBA or overseas or wherever. I think those 2 guys will be playing professional basketball after this season. Fulgerson's shown some really good development. Obviously, if he had that injury he had his first year at Tennessee, his development could be going even smoother than what it is. But I like what his development is. He's a guy could be very close to averaging a double-double for Tennessee this year. He's already averaging 11 and 8 here in the start of the season. He could very easily get that to about 11-8, 11-9, maybe get to 12-10, 11-10, something like that. He's a guy who I could think could be maybe a 10-10 night type of guy for a lot of games. So Barnes and his staff have definitely hit on a lot more than they've missed. But I think I don't think you can have a wrong answer necessarily in this conversation about is it more impressive that Barnes and his staff and that's not to discount the players. They've obviously I think you've mentioned it on Swain's show, Ben. I mean, Pons has put in a ton of work this offseason, not only playing with the French professional team, but also just working on his shot, taking 300 shots in the gym a day. I mean, that's the same thing you heard about Admiral and Grant doing, and Kyle and Bone, all those guys, what they did in the off seasons to help improve themselves. Pons always said, he didn't have to go to fat camp, as they called it, for like what Grant and Admiral had to. He didn't have a whole lot of fat on his body when he got to Tennessee, but he's bulked up even a little bit more now at 6'6", 215. I mean, this guy, if he keeps this up, I mean, he's going to be an all-SEC player this year, and it will be a huge, pleasant surprise for Tennessee basketball. But Ben, not a whole lot more marquee matchups for Tennessee this week. They'll be playing a couple, hopefully gimmies on the schedule here in the next couple of days, like the Alabama State and Thompson-Boling Arena. Then they'll play Chattanooga, which Chattanooga is a good team. They're a good mid-major team historically. This season, they're currently 3-1 on the year. So I mean, that'll be a little bit more of a challenge than I think most kind of smaller non-conference teams will be. But Tennessee should win both those games, and then that'll set up another neutral site matchup in Florida for the Emerald Coast Classic, where they'll be facing Florida State, which is a borderline top 25 team. They beat Florida to start the year. Then we could sit here and talk about basketball the whole podcast, because the SEC, there have been a lot of interesting developments in the SEC, with Florida dropping out of the top 25 after being number 6 in the country, Kentucky losing, LSU dropping out of the top 25. There's a lot, and Auburn falling a little bit too, actually. There's a lot we could discuss, but I think we'll go ahead and move on here to some football talk, because while it's the bye week, there's still obviously plenty to talk about with Tennessee football. Ben, what if I told you in the middle of watching Missouri just get, I wouldn't even say curb stomp, just get slowly beat to death by Florida in a 23-6 loss? What if I told you Saturday afternoon, while that game was happening, that Missouri was going to open up as essentially a touchdown favorite over Tennessee on Sunday? What would your reaction have been if I told you that Saturday while you're watching Missouri just not do anything on offense against Florida?
I would have told you that you were lying to me and that you were crazy.
Well, as I'm sure most listeners here know, that's exactly what happened. Missouri opened up by some books as a 6-point favorite, by some books as a 7-point favorite. That's since dropped, and now the consensus seems to be around a 5-point favorite. But Missouri opened up as a surprisingly, not huge, but a surprisingly big favorite over Tennessee for their matchup in Columbia this weekend. I think maybe part of that is, the odds makers realize that Missouri is typically a better home team than they are away team. But that game against Florida was at home, and that game against Florida was ugly. Missouri has scored a grand total of 1 offensive touchdown in their last 12 quarters of play. Favoring them by touchdown just seems bizarre when they can't even score a touchdown on offense. I don't disagree with Missouri maybe being favored necessarily, because I just think maybe that's just odds makers had, I think, Missouri as like a 2-touchdown to 16-point favorite a couple weeks ago or a week and a half ago maybe, and I think that's obviously come down a lot from there. But at the same time, with Tennessee rolling, with them coming off a bye week, I also would understand them being road favorites. I don't know. To me, it was a big surprise that Missouri was favored as much as they were. Not necessarily that Missouri was favored, just that they were favored by the amount of points that they haven't even scored in the last 2 games total. I mean, if you look at some books by 7-point favorite, Missouri scored 6 points in the last 2 games combined. I mean, that's just, they have a good defense. I mean, they have a pretty decent defense. But Ben, I think with the matchups of this game, looking at it, Kelly Bryant's obviously still not 100%. He's not playing great. Missouri's rushing attack hasn't been as good as I think they were hoping it would be this year. The defense is good, but at the same time, I think y'all are having a good conversation about that on the Swain events on Monday morning, about Missouri's interior of the defense looks to be kind of their strength, and Tennessee's interior of their offensive line is their strength when it comes to blocking. I think I would trust Brandon Kennedy and Trey Smith a little bit more to withstand pressure and to hold off a premier defensive lineman more than I would the true freshmen in Wanya Morris and Donald Wright. That's not because I don't trust those two. I just think Brandon Kennedy and Trey Smith have been playing at an all-SEC level this year, and I think those two are very well equipped to handle Missouri's interior presence. And Missouri doesn't have a great pass rush. They're one of the bottom teams in the SEC in terms of sacks. I just think this game, I was surprised that Missouri was favored as much as they were, because Missouri has just been, they've been horrible the last, 3-4 weeks at this point. Like I said, they've scored a grand total of 13 points on offense over their last 12 quarters of play, and only one of those has been a touchdown. I think Tennessee should win this game. We'll talk a little bit more about the matchups and a little bit more about Missouri later on this week in the second podcast. But to me, Ben, this game has gone from a game, just a couple weeks ago where I was very hesitant to say Tennessee will win this game, that I've talked about all season, that this game worries me because it's Missouri and Tennessee just has trouble playing them, and that Missouri, Barry Odom and this team hates Tennessee. that is being played in Columbia, and that for most of the season it seemed like Missouri was just a very different team at home. Well, they didn't look like a different team at home against Florida. They looked like the same team that lost to Vanderbilt, the same team that got shut out by Georgia. They were lucky to not get shut out in this game. To me, I think I've gone from Tennessee, very hesitantly saying I think Tennessee keep it close, but I think Missouri wins, to now I think Tennessee actually should win this game, and I think Vol fans should be disappointed if they don't win this game.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it reminds me of the Kentucky game, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Where I think Tennessee is the better overall football team, but if Tennessee does not play like it has against Kentucky in the second half, South Carolina, UAB in the first half, Mississippi State in the second half, Alabama for three quarters, Georgia in the first half, if that isn't the Tennessee team that shows up, then Missouri absolutely has the talent to beat Tennessee. There's no doubt about it. And yes, they've lost 4 in a row, and they lost at Vanderbilt 21-24. They got blown out at Kentucky. They lost 27-0 to Georgia. And then this weekend, as you mentioned, they lost 23-6 to Florida. So, yes, they have lost 4 in a row. And one of those losses was to Vanderbilt. And, yes, they lost to Wyoming to begin the season. But they still have the talent to beat Tennessee if Tennessee does not play like they have recently since the end of September. And to me, just kind of looking at this roster, I don't understand how Missouri has had such a terrible season and how they're 5-5 and 2-4 in SEC play. I understand their loss to Georgia, their loss to Florida, scoring 6 points the last 2 weekends. Kelly Bryant has been banged up. Florida and Georgia both have good defenses, but to lose to Kentucky, get blown out by Kentucky, to lose to Vanderbilt at all, and to lose to Wyoming does not make sense to me. So that tells me that Missouri has plenty of talent and not very good coaching. And Barry Odom somewhat called Derek Dooley out following Saturday's loss. He didn't, say Derek Dooley's name, but he was asked something along the lines of what the heck is wrong with the offense, and he responded and said that he did not think the coaching staff was putting the players in a position to have success. And Nathaniel, what is Barry Odom known as?
A defensive coach.
That is right. Who is their offensive coordinator?
The one and only Derek Dooley.
Which tells me if the defensive guy, who is the head coach, is saying that the coaching staff isn't putting the offensive players in a position for the offense to have success, that tells me that Derek Dooley is not doing a very good job at the moment. So I point that out to say, don't be surprised if these Missouri players on offense have a big game. Albert, everybody calls him Albert O, but I'll take a stab at his last name. Albert Okukwabunam. He is an NFL tight end. He is a stud tight end. They do have receivers, Jonathan Nance. Kelly Bryant, we know, has all the talent in the world. He's been banged up this season and, in my opinion, has not been used all that well. Larry Roundtree and Tyler Beatty, their top 2 running backs, are very good, especially Larry Roundtree. So they've been banged up along the offensive line at times. Kelly Bryant's been banged up, but ultimately their offensive game plans have been butt booty terrible, and that is why you have not seen them have success. So I say all that to say, if Tennessee does not show up and play the Tennessee football that they've played the last 2 months, they will absolutely lose this football game. So, and that's kind of how I felt about the Kentucky game, to where Kentucky has the talent to beat Tennessee, but Tennessee is playing better as a team overall. So if that Tennessee shows up, they'll be fine in Lexington. They did in the second half, and they won. So as long as Tennessee shows up and plays the way that they have since the beginning of October, since the first half of the Georgia game, they'll be perfectly fine, in my opinion. Although, like you mentioned, traveling to Columbia scares me. Since Tennessee joined, or I should say, since Missouri joined the SEC East, Tennessee is 1-2 in Columbia and 2-5 against Missouri overall. So there's something about this Missouri football program that just causes Tennessee to lose regardless of which teams are on the sideline. So it's a scary trip because it's Columbia. You don't know if Tennessee will come off the bye week revamped and in a better situation in terms of injuries, more healthy, which would obviously benefit Tennessee, or do they come out kind of rusty, kind of sleepwalking? So, again, as long as they continue to play the football that they have been playing, they will be perfectly fine, and they will win this football game, eventually get to 7-5 and make a Florida bowl game. But they can't take Missouri lightly just because they have not had success of late, because they have plenty of talent, both offensively and defensively, to win this football game as well.
A weird stat to me, you mentioned all the really good offensive players that Missouri has. But obviously, Albert O, he's been the leading pass catcher for them this year. With at least some touchdowns, he has 6 touchdowns on the season, which is the most on the team. A Missouri wide receiver has not caught a touchdown pass for the Tigers this season since October 5th in their 42-10 win against Troy. Every other game since then, no Missouri wideout has caught a touchdown pass. You've got Jonathan Nance, who's been a consistent target. He's got 4 catches, 58 yards against Florida, 4 for 45 against Georgia, 3 for 23 against Kentucky. But he hasn't caught a touchdown pass since Troy. And you also had Jalen Knox caught a touchdown pass in that game too. Otherwise, all the other the touchdown receptions by Missouri this season, and since those games, have come by Alberto, actually, who has 6 touchdowns on the year. You have Tyler Beatty, who's the running back you mentioned, Ben, who's caught 3 on the year. So it's been Alberto and Tyler Beatty, who's been, although they haven't really been scoring touchdowns at all offense the last couple weeks, but they haven't had, the wide receivers haven't been able to get free to get to the end zone. I mean, it's been kind of bizarre. This offense went from last year being, obviously Drew Lock and Kelly Brown are 2 very different quarterbacks, but they went from having just this pass happy, just everybody's going to grab it. It seemed like everyone's going to be able to get a touchdown in that offense last year, through the air and in on the ground, because they had a really good rushing attack last year too. Then now suddenly, not only can they not score, but if you're a wideout in this Missouri offense, you're almost non-existent. You'll pick up some yards, and I'm sure Nance and Knox and Jonathan Johnson have all gotten first down grabs and things like that. But it's just kind of bizarre to me that this offense that seemed very, very wide receiver friendly last season and the last just couple years hasn't been anywhere close to what they were expecting it to be. Tyler Beatty is 3rd or 2nd on the team in receiving yards, and he's the leading receiver in terms of catches this season with 30. That's a running back, and obviously he's a very good weapon. He's I think he's 2nd on the team in rushing. Yeah, he's 2nd on the team in rushing, 2nd on the team in receiving in terms of yards. So he's got over 700 yards of total offense this season, or just about 700 yards of total offense this season. I think he has 5 total touchdowns on the season. So he's a very useful weapon in both the rushing attack and in the passing game. But yeah, Ben, when you mention it there, you look at their roster, it's baffling to me that they're not better than what they are, both offensively and defensively. Defensively, their defense has done a decent job of being able to keep them in games. I'm just watching the Florida game last week. In that first half, that defense was doing a good job of keeping Florida's offense off guard, of they were getting kind of torched a little bit through the air here and there, but they weren't, they were still in that game. 20-6 is a game that, that's a 2-score victory, I guess technically a 3-score victory for Florida, but it was close for most of the game. It was within reach of Missouri. Their offense just could not get anything going. They held Georgia's offense to 27 points, which I say held. That's still quite a bit, but Georgia's offense has been scoring more than that. Kentucky did put up quite a bit of points on them, 29-7. But this has been an defense that's done I think a decent job this year of containing things and doing a good job. But it's starting to come unglued here at the end, Ben. It's just been a very interesting, and I'll be try to get a Missouri beat writer or someone on the podcast or on an interview later on this week. I know you guys will probably have TJ Moe on the Swain event because he and Swain are friends, and Mo used to play for Missouri. Actually, I had him on the podcast I think last year before the Missouri game last season to talk about the Tigers. But it's kind of weird to me this team's not better than what they are. And I go back to actually I think an interesting point that, speaking of TJ Moe, that he made in the preseason when you all had him on the Swain event where he talked about Missouri. It seems like, and I know Vol fans always feel the same way with Tennessee football too, but it's interesting that another school kind of feels the exact same way. He said it seems like every year when Missouri is supposed to be really good is the year they go out and they have massive disappointments. It was the years like last year, I think, where they weren't expected to be as good as they were, and they went out and had a really good season. that's been the case. A lot of people were expecting Missouri to maybe finish second in the SEC this year, maybe even give Georgia a little bit running for their money. And then now suddenly they're in the exact same spot Tennessee is in at 5-5. And this game I think this game will probably decide who finishes third in the SEC East, which is a very surprising place for Tennessee to be. But it's one where Missouri maybe should have been, but maybe not at 5-5 where they are right now. They went from having hopes of getting to maybe New Year's Six Bowl to maybe competing for the SEC East to maybe finishing even second in the East to now suddenly, they could be bottom half of the SEC East pretty easily here at the end of this season. So it's been weird to me, Ben. We'll go more in depth about Missouri later on this week in the second podcast, and you and I will both have plenty of articles and content and stuff on RockyTopInsider.com, and you and Jason Swin will talk on the Swin event, I'm sure, about Missouri all week this week as well. Well, Ben, we're going to have plenty about Missouri, plenty about Tennessee basketball. Lady Vols play on Tuesday night. Men play on Wednesday. And, of course, the football team plays on Saturday. So, full week of Tennessee athletics. We're in the crossover where you have basketball starting to pick up steam. Football's in full swing. So, we got a lot of content for you on the site right now. We'll have videos both of Kelly Harper and Rick Barnes, who met with the media today. We'll probably have a full video of Jeremy Pruitt here up just a little bit as well after get done editing the podcast here. So if you missed any of the press conferences today, be sure to check it out tonight on RockyTopInsider.com or in the morning. Whenever you're listening to this, be sure to check it out. We have pieces up there about Tennessee, both men's and women's teams, and basketball getting ranked. We'll have plenty of stuff this week about Tennessee football, about Missouri, about the health of Tennessee players, and everything as well. Signing off for Ben McKee, I am Nathaniel Rutherford. Thank you all again. This has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.